Alright folks, so today we're looking at the beginnings of civilization. For the last week or so we've been looking at societies and culture and things like that. Today we're going to start talking about the first time that we have something that's an actual civilization. So we're going to talk about what that actually means and so on in this section. But again, in your textbook, the Yellow Global Studies textbook that you guys will be getting this week, this would be Chapter 1, Section 3. Okay, so our lesson objectives for this section is the first one is to describe where many of the world's first civilizations arise. So there were people living all over the world around the time that we're going to be talking about today. However, in specific parts of the world is where the first civilizations arise. So we'll talk about where those happen and why that occurs. Our next objective is to define surplus and explain how it affected the development of civilizations. You could not have a civilization without a surplus, and we'll talk about that. Then we're going to list and explain the 7 features that define a civilization. These are basically the 7 things that your society needed to have in order for you to have what anthropologists and archaeologists and historians would consider a civilization versus just a society. Then we'll look at and explain how the environment affects people's lives. We've talked about this before, but depending on where you live, your environment was different, and that would affect how you live. If you lived in the Arctic, your life would be quite a bit different than if you lived in the desert or you lived in the rainforest, for example. We're then going to look at these 2 terms, the first one called city-states and then empires. So what are those? They become very important with what we'll talk about in later chapters this year. And then lastly, and probably the most important thing that you'll learn this year, is this term called cultural diffusion. We will be talking about this all the time. From now on, whenever we look at a society, we'll be looking at the cultural diffusion that occurred in that society and then with neighboring societies. So we'll talk about what that means in this section. You'll be first introduced to that today. So going to our first objective is to describe where many of the world's first civilizations arise. Most of the world's earliest civilizations arise in river valleys. And what we mean by a river valley, right, is where when it rains in the mountains, okay, there's a valley where the water drains down to, and there are often rivers in those valleys. So we live in the Lake Champlain Valley, or I do anyway, living in Plattsburgh. I live in the Lake Champlain Valley. Any of the rain that falls in the Adirondacks flows down the Adirondacks through the Saranac River, Ausable River, and so on, and eventually they flow into Lake Champlain. So river valleys throughout the world, some of the larger river valleys had very large rivers where people settled and many people were able to live and sustain themselves in these river valleys. So they rise in river valleys. I'm just going to show you a couple pictures here of river valleys. Here's a river valley from National Geographic found in Africa. So one of the big things to consider is why river valleys? Why river valleys and not rainforests or near lakes or near the ocean or things like that? So most of the world's civilizations developed near river valleys, so why is that? Now, in a river valley, you have a regular water supply for drinking water. You cannot live longer than 2 or 3 days without having water. So in order to sustain a large population, which civilizations need to have large populations, you have to have a regular water supply for those people. So rivers provide a lot of drinking water. We then have transportation, right? Rivers allow you to get downriver very easily just by building something that is floatable. You can put some stuff on it and it will float you down the river. Right? So allowed for trade, allowed for transportation. Animals also drank the rivers. So humans were first hunters and gatherers, which we said. So when you would want to hunt animals and you would look for a river or a place where there was fresh water where the animals would drink, and a lot of the animals drank at these rivers. So people settled near these rivers and knew that's where they could hunt. Conditions favored farming. Right? And this is the biggest reason why civilizations started near river valleys. In order to have a civilization, you had to have a large surplus of food. That could only be done through farming. So these first civilizations who are near a river valley were able to farm quite a bit. Right? Were able to farm extensively. And they were able to do this because of the floodwaters. Every spring, spring, the waters in the rivers would flood as there was more rain and the snow melt from the mountains and things like that. That would spread silt from the rivers, fertilizing the soils in the valley. Eventually, the water would go down right after the flood stage was done, and then that would leave behind the silt, and you would have a very fertile soil. So all the river valleys where first civilization started had very fertile soil around the rivers. This allowed them to be able to farm extensively. However, you have to realize not all the world's first civilizations arise in river valleys. Many of the first ones that we're going to talk about do. There are a few exceptions to that rule, though. If you look at Mesoamerica, in modern-day Mexico and Central America, you have the Mayas and the Aztecs. They did not settle near a river valley. And then in the Andes Mountains in South America, you have the Incan civilization, which did not develop near a river valley. But they did have other sources of water. So in Mesoamerica, they developed, in other than river valleys, like I said, they learned to farm on mountainsides or near lakes. So in Mexico, there were some very large lakes that they were able to settle near, fresh water, were able to farm there. And the Andes Mountains, they were able to farm in the mountains. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Inca civilization later in the year. So there are 4 early river valley civilizations that you need to know settled near river valleys. We will talk about all of these as the year goes on. Most of these we'll be talking about in the next few weeks or so. The first one is Egypt, right? Egyptian civilization. You think of pharaohs and the pyramids and the Sphinx and all those things you guys might have seen before or heard of before. That was because of the Nile River, right? Which flows from south to north throughout the desert in Egypt. Many people settled in Egypt, and they were able to develop this very large, flourishing civilization there because of the river. In our next chapter, the first known civilization in the world was known as Sumer. This was found in a place called the Fertile Crescent or Mesopotamia, and that was located in between 2 rivers, right in the Middle East, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. So we'll look at more of them next week. And then you have the Indus civilization, which is found in India, which develops along the Indus River, which flows from the Himalayan mountains and the Hindu Kush mountains, some of the highest mountains in the world, down to the Arabian Sea. And many people settled in this area of the world. And then we go to China, and in China there were several rivers that were settled, and civilizations were developed around. You have the Wang River, the Chang River, the Wei River. The Wang River also be known as the Yellow River. All right, so our next objective is to define surplus and explain how it affects the development of civilizations. A surplus, if you remember from your last vocab quiz, is just more than is necessary or more than you need. So when we talk about surplus in this class, we're talking about food. So eventually, societies were able to develop surpluses of food. More food than they needed, and more food than you need equals more people. So farmers were able to produce a surplus of food, or more than is necessary, like I said, and more food equals more people. We talked about this with the difference between hunting and farming. When you could farm and produce, and you got really good at farming, and you were really successful at farming, you could produce more food than you needed. When you had more food, you could have more people in your society. So population increased, people had more children, and they were able to survive because there was enough food to feed all of them. Eventually cities are created, so you go from having the first towns to now you have the first cities, and this is really where you start to see the first types of civilizations, when you have these large cities where maybe tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people eventually lived in these cities. In cities, people work jobs other than farming, and this becomes really important to civilization. The idea that people had other jobs, and this is called job specialization. And if you think about it, the people living in New York City, almost none of them are farmers. Right? They get their food from farmers who live in the countryside, who produce the food, and they go and buy it. So same thing kind of happened right at this time. People who lived in the cities, not all of them could farm. There wasn't enough room, there wasn't enough land for them to farm. So they did other jobs. The farmers produced the food, and they were able to eat the food that the farmers produced while they did other things for the society. And this is the first time we start to see this, is when these first cities developed. All right, so now we're going to list and explain the 7 features that define a civilization. These are basically the 7 things that you need in order to have a civilization. There are a couple of these that some civilizations did not have, but for the most part, if you had a civilization, and we're talking about thousands of years ago, if you had a society that we would consider a civilization, you had all of these things. So the first one's organized government, then complex religion, job specialization, which we just kind of talked about. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. Social classes, arts and architecture, public works, and then writing. Right? And writing is kind of the one exception where not all of the earliest civilizations had writing. Most did, but not all were able to develop a written language. So we'll look at all of these in detail here. So like I said again, the first one is organized government. For a society to function, you had thousands and maybe even hundreds of thousands of people within your society. You had to have an organized government. So you needed more powerful and organized governments than what they had. These governments needed to oversee large projects to make sure that the people survived and were able to thrive. So some examples of these large projects: food supply. They had to make sure there was enough food for everybody in their society. Like I said again, tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of people. You had to make sure that all of those people were fed. You needed an organized government to do that. You needed an organized government to make sure you had enough water. If you didn't have enough water, people died. And when people died, your civilization would fall apart, your society would fall apart. So the government had to oversee that. And then they had to oversee the defense. They had to have a military, because if you had a lot of resources, there were other people near you who would want your resources. They would do that by taking it from you, killing you and taking it from you. So this forced societies, this forced civilizations eventually to develop military, to develop armies to protect their people. And you had to have an organized government to do that. Not everybody could just get some weapons and go out there and be successful. You had to have an organized, trained military, and that was done by this organized government. Right? And that's complex, right? It's not just one person making all the decisions, although a lot of times there was one person who made most decisions, but there were a lot of other people who were in the wings who were also helping out. So it was a complex government. So there were separate departments usually. So one of the first ones we're going to look at, Sumer, and then Egypt next week. They had these complex governments where there were separate departments. So there was a military. There were guys who collected taxes. There was the noble families. There were the priests who had a specific job in the government, and so on. So there were separate departments, very much like our government today, right? We have the Congress, we have the Supreme Court, and then we have the executive branch, the president and vice president, and many, many other parts of the government that take care of different things. Warriors and priests tended to have the most power in these governments. They were the most important. Religion was really important, and the warriors were the ones who protected the civilization, so they became very important as well in these first societies and civilizations. Our next feature is complex religions. In every one of these first civilizations, you had the idea of polytheism. This was the type of religion. They differed in what the religions believed, but they were all polytheistic, or this idea of polytheism. So most ancient people were polytheistic. Okay, polytheistic is when you believe in many gods. And most of the time these gods have a specific purpose. So there might be a sun god, a river god, a war god, a god of peace, a god of the afterlife, right? All these types of things. So there was a god for everything that was important to that society in most of these civilizations. You think of Greece. If you guys ever did anything with Greek mythology, you would recognize some of the gods and goddesses that are in this drawing or this painting here. Right, you had Zeus, right, who's the king of the gods. Right, you had Poseidon, who was the sea god of the sea. Right, Ares, who was the god of war. Right, there's a bunch of them who all had a specific purpose and were overseeing a specific part of the world or of the universe. In these religions, you see complex rituals, so ceremonies, dances, sacrifices, even right? Animal sacrifice. You really see in the Greek religion, there was a lot of animal sacrifice that happened, and even in some parts of the world, you had human sacrifice. So when we talk about the Aztec society from Mesoamerica later in the year, one of the things that they practiced was human sacrifice, and that was part of their religion. So then we get to job specialization. Job specialization is a really important feature of civilization. You cannot have a civilization without people having specific jobs. Not everybody can do the same job in a civilization. There are different things that need to be done, and in order for them to be done better, you had to specialize in one job over another. Some people were really good at farming, some people were good at being warriors, some people were priests, some people could write, so they were scribes, some people could make stuff, so they were artisans. You had to have job specialization. You have to have job specialization to have a organized civilization. So people in cities developed hundreds of new crafts. They could not farm, so they had to do something else for a living. People had to specialize in certain jobs, and people became artisans, or known as skilled craft workers. Right? These are the people who produce stuff, and it takes skill to make. So like pottery, for example, jewelry, and then metal workers would make tools and weapons which were necessary for the society to function, right? For farmers and then for warriors to fight battles. There were other workers, right? There were other people other than artisans and farmers. So you had people who were bricklayers who would help build a lot of the buildings and the architecture of the society, of the city. You'd have soldiers that was their job. Their job was to be a soldier. If there was a war that needed to be fought or people needed to be protected, they were there to do that. You have merchants. We'll talk quite a bit about merchants here, but merchants are the people who would trade stuff. So they would trade, in this case, a fish for some grain. And they could become very wealthy at doing this. Right? They would try to trade up all the time. So once money is developed, they try to buy stuff cheaply and then sell it for more money. So think of business owners, right? Somebody who owns a convenience store is a merchant. They try to buy stuff cheap and then sell it to other people for more money. So the first types of merchants that would have traded things, would have bartered for things. You have entertainers, right? Storytellers, musicians. You needed somebody to entertain the people, to entertain especially the royal family, the noble family of most of these societies. All right, our next feature is social classes, but for this vodcast, I'm going to end it here. I don't want to go too much longer than 15 minutes or so. So I'll end it here. I will make another vodcast for the next section, which you'll have to do tomorrow night. All right, make sure you completed the guided notes. Remember, you can pause, you can rewind, you can go backwards through all of these things. You can replay it. You can watch this as many times as you want. So just make sure you come to class with the guided notes, okay, and willing to talk and discuss about some of the things that you've seen today. All right, see you guys tomorrow. See you in class.